You'd be forgiven if you'd never heard of the game Heroes Over Europe. This is a 2009 release which is a direct sequel to Heroes of the Pacific on the original Xbox, released in 2005. In the run-up to the release of Heroes Over Europe, the developer, Transmission Games, promised to bring more intense combat, improved graphics, and a deeper dive into historical warfare. 15 years later, let's take a little look to see how the game holds up today. As you would imagine, the game centers around aerial combat missions, offering the chance for you to engage in several dogfights. You will control one of 3 different pilots. Now, they don't have specific skills or anything, which would have been kind of cool, I guess. They are just completely different people for the purposes of the story. You will encounter some historical battles, for example, the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Bulge. For people familiar with the history of World War II, this can be quite thrilling and a little bit more immersive or engaging. For those unfamiliar with the history of World War II, this will mean the difference between grass and snow. There are 2 different control types within Heroes Over Europe, the first of which is an arcade style, which is basically a simplified control system for people to just be able to jump into the game without really worrying what button does what. And then of course for the enthusiasts, there is a professional type that tries to be more like a flight sim, although this does kind of fall by the wayside slightly. It can be satisfying if you're willing to put the time into this to sort of learn how everything works, which I'm guessing you're probably not. Given the fact that of course that multiplayer probably doesn't exist anymore, that's something that I unfortunately didn't get a chance to test. The overall presentation of Heroes Over Europe is actually quite excellent. Again, going back to if you're interested in the time period and of course World War II in general, you'll be pleased to know that there are newsreel style intros or cutscenes between missions, which make it very immersive and interesting experience. And even in the loading screens, they have propaganda posters of the time that deliver tips, hints and tricks on your next mission, which is something a little bit different just to the standard loading screen you would find in a game. At the time, Heroes Over Europe delivered competent visuals. The game didn't look fantastic, but it definitely didn't look bad. The aircraft models were impressively detailed and the game's environment captured the essence of wartime Europe, from the skies and in particular over London or the fields of France. However, by today's standards, the graphics do appear dated, textures can be rather muddy, and the environments lack the vibrancy and the detail seen in modern titles, which is absolutely no surprise to anyone. The audio experience is a bit of a mixed bag. The sound effects, especially the roar of the engines and the rattle of the machine guns, are immersive and they do contribute to the game's atmosphere. The musical score, on the other hand, while it is appropriate, often fades into the background, and the voice acting is, well, serviceable, but it's not particularly memorable. It's rather stereotypical of the time and it really does lack depth. It's enough to see you through, and of course you do have the cutscenes which do add the immersion. I would actually say that the acting during the cutscenes, the newsreel style, is far better and far more believable, if you will, than the main characters themselves. That's where I actually got most of my enjoyment from the story. Speaking of which, while the storyline adds a personal touch to the missions, it often feels secondary to the action. The characters are not deeply developed and their arcs are fairly predictable. It was almost like the story was a bit of an afterthought to the gameplay itself, which in a game like this is not necessarily a good thing as it can be in other games. These games need to be historically accurate and they need to be immersive for those who enjoy this sort of time period. However, as I mentioned, the game does manage to evoke a sense of wartime urgency, and despite the mediocre voice acting from the main characters, you will feel yourself immersed, I would say 75% of the time here. More so, of course, if you are interested in the time period. Now, for all the positives this game does have, gameplay-wise, it does have a few negatives. The collision is something that is very frustrating at times, because you never know when you're going to crash and burn, or whether you're just going to bounce off another plane. This is something that a lot of people hoped would be patched at some point, and of course, as it's 15 years later and it still hasn't been patched, I've kind of given up hope of that ever happening. Essentially, you will often bounce off your enemy when you collide with them, which is obviously a problem with the colliders in the game. I wouldn't imagine it would be that difficult to fix, although as I mentioned, it's not going to happen now, but it can be a little bit irritating when you see other planes crash into each other and they don't actually crash, they sort of bounce, and it obviously happens to you as well. You'll go straight into an enemy plane and expect to clip them. Maybe they are just about to blow up themselves and that little clip would have been enough to take them out. Maybe you would have taken yourself out in the process, who knows. However, you never get to find out because you just bounce off them, you find yourself spinning or the other way around, and then you have to go again, which does break immersion vision slightly. The game has one distinct game mechanic, and this is called the ace kill mechanic, which allows for cinematic takedowns when specific conditions are met. Essentially, you can lock in on an enemy and take him down. It goes into some sort of half cinematic, almost like Burnout, I guess. And you can do that almost as many times as you like, and it can be satisfying, although after a while it does get a little bit repetitive and it does feel slightly gimmicky, and that does kind of lend itself to the entire game, to be honest. The game does get very repetitive the more you progress through the story. Missions often boil down to very similar objectives. It's dogfight or bombing run or an escort mission. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, of course it does. You're in a plane. What would you expect? And I very much agree, but I've played many of these type of games, you know, your Ace Combats and the like, and those games, although some of them can be repetitive, they offer enough variety to keep you engaged, and it doesn't feel like you're just repeating the same thing over and over again. With Heroes Over Europe, despite the fact that I actually like the game, I do find myself doing the same sort of thing over and over, and I notice that I'm doing it over and over, and that's the biggest downfall of the game in my opinion. Some may say that the difficulty settings need to be tweaked here or there, because even on the easiest setting, which is something that I would often associate with, I want to enjoy the story and more or less treat the game like a film. So rather than have to really concentrate on what I'm doing or work really hard at defeating a certain enemy, the easy difficulty setting should be there for me to be able to breeze through and just enjoy the story. However, in the latter missions, it can get a little bit tricky even on easy. Some of the cargo ships, for example, take an awful lot of time to destroy. You can be there for upwards of 20 minutes sometimes just to destroy one cargo ship. You then get launched into a dogfight, which you will navigate with ease, I'm sure, and then you are thrown back into a scenario where you have to take down not one, but two cargo ships. And you can imagine how long that takes, given it took 20 minutes to take down one in the first place. On the harder difficulty setting, this is of course amplified yet again, which I would expect and don't have any problem with whatsoever. However, on the easy setting, some may argue that it should take less time to do. Personally, I didn't really have a problem with it, and I kind of enjoyed it for what it was, although I can understand why some people will get annoyed by how long it takes to take these things down. And despite the fact that I have picked up on a lot of negatives here, the game is overall very good. It's not in any way a realistic flight sim, it is 100% an arcade dogfight simulator, but what a dogfight simulator it is, especially as I've mentioned previously in this video about 20 times. If you're interested in the time period, you'll actually find this game pretty good. And for the price point as well, you can absolutely not go wrong, and given the price of the Xbox 360 games at the moment, this is definitely on the lower end and will only ever really go up from here. And although repetitive, will definitely repay that £2.50 price tag that it currently has.